Hi, I'm Ed Thorne and welcome to part 2 of this video series, which is documenting setting up a professional mixing and mastering studio in a flat in London. The question is, can it be done successfully? If you haven't seen part 1 yet, check that out where I explore the pitfalls, the problems, I do some acoustic research in terms of leakage, and I do some theoretical analysis into what the modes and the frequency issues in this room may be. If you haven't seen that, there's a link in the description below. Check that out, it's well worth a watch to give you a background behind this whole series. In this video today, we're searching for the optimal listening position in this room. We're going to be using a measurement microphone and Room EQ Wizard software, which is going to help us find where the peaks and the nulls are in the room. The peaks are obviously the buildup of frequencies, and the nulls are where frequencies are cancelling out. So we need to find the optimal listening position, which I'll mark on the floor, and then we need to find the optimal position for the speakers. To find the sweet spot in the room, we're going to play pink noise out of the Room software through my Amphion 115 speaker placed in the corner. I've placed it in the corner to activate the room as much as possible and give us an honest representation of how the room sounds. Now, white noise is equal energy per frequency up the frequency spectrum, but pink noise is equal energy per octave, meaning that the lower frequencies have more energy than the higher frequencies, which is a lot closer to how we actually perceive sound and audio. So you'll see I was moving the microphone up and down at the 1/3 point and the 2/3 point, which didn't really make much of a difference. It just had different characteristics. But realistically, that's going to be impractical. So I think we're looking at the golden ratio rule, which is in about a third, 33 to 38% of the room. Now I was finding under a third, so about 30% was measuring quite well. A little, the further back we went, you could see the null that was pretty much at about 60 creep up to 80. Now, obviously, there's going to be a problem at that frequency range in the room. It's just a matter of mitigating it by choosing how high we sit or low we sit and how far forward and back into the room we go. All right, I want to get a bit more of an accurate picture of the room at the 1/3 listening point. So we're 1.4 meters down the length of the 4.2 meter room. And I've set the microphone up at 90 centimeters, which is probably the lower end of where I might be sitting. In my old studio, I sat at about 125. So we're gonna do 3 readings and see just how that changes as we go up the height by like 10, 15 centimeters. And we'll get a better idea of other things like the decay time in the room, which I already know and you can hear is pretty bad. Ooh, that's not too bad already. Immediately, this actually isn't as bad as I thought it was going to be. I was expecting this decay time to be upwards of half a second in the 500 milliseconds region. But to say above 500 hertz, it's below 300 milliseconds. That's promising. The high end is a lot easier to treat than the low end, as we know, so I'm pretty sure we can get quite a much slower decay a quicker decay, in the upper mids. The lower mids are a bit of an issue. Obviously we can see these red zones where the decay is particularly slow. That's where these frequencies are obviously building up in the room. But like I said, we can EQ those out or down at least, and the acoustic paneling I've got is designed to work in this frequency range in the low mids between 100 and 400 hertz. So we can control this. You can see where the null is at about 56 hertz. We're going to have to deal with that, I think, in this position. But moving the microphone, of course, may alleviate that. But initially, this isn't as bad as I thought it was going to be. So I'm quite optimistic about this already. Let's do 105 centimeters tall. Okay, similar issues, but actually 1 or 2 things are taking longer to decay, and the null is still a null, but that's a little bit higher up now at about 60. So bit of a change, but not drastic. There are a couple of notches now in the upper mids, which we need to keep an eye on. So I've just measured with the microphone at 120 centimeters. In other words, our listening height at 120 above the floor. And despite being concerned it was close to the middle of the room and might be problematic, it's actually alleviated the null at 60 hertz by 4 or 5 to 6 decibels. And this is the flattest I've seen this response already. So I think that might be the listening height, which is not what I expected. So the test suggests some interesting information. At 90 centimeters above the ground listening position, it's reasonably flat. Now, if you're looking at this thinking this is horrific, trust me, this isn't that bad. Remember, the peaks we can easily curtail by reducing the amplitude of those frequencies. Things to note are, at about 800 to 1000, we've only got a 6 dB dip. It's not ideal, but I think we can get around that. That's certainly something Trinov can handle. At 105 centimeters tall, that dip at 940 gets a little bit worse. And at 120, it's worse than it was at 90 centimeters, but it's not as bad as the middle height. But the key thing at 60 hertz is the null is about 4, 5, 6 decibels less than it was. So I'm tempted to take this position all day long. With that analysis complete and the sweet spot and the optimal listening position found, I need to do this test again when I've plugged the window. At the moment I've got single glazed windows and I'm concerned noise is going to escape onto the street and potentially into next door if they have windows open, which could be a complaint further down the road. So I need to build a window plug. So let's do that. Then we'll remeasure. Then we need to find the optimal position for the speakers. Oh, PS. Get a tape measure for all of this stuff. Absolute godsend. The plan is to make a plyboard rock wool sandwich, and I might put some tech sound in it, but I think for now I'm going to avoid that because it's going to be very, very heavy as it is. I have long sleeves on, trousers, a mask, gloves, and goggles as eye protectors, and a bread knife for chopping the rock wool. Wish me luck. Okay, what I've done is basically sandwiched the plyboards, put bolts through them, and I've obviously left a load of rock wool around the edge. Now I'm then going to wrap this in a moving blanket just to seal all the dust in. And then these boards have been measured, my brother-in-law cut these, Chisbert, to within 0.5 centimetre of the window. And then this is just overkill, so I can wedge it in and it'll have some purchase on the window frame. Now I can always cut this back further if I need to. All right, after a lot of sweat and jiggery pokery, I got this in. But I'm not convinced how much it's doing because I can slightly still hear stuff, but it is definitely going to stop a lot of direct sound going out. So what I want to do now is another SPL test with my soundbar, and then I've got to remeasure the room and see if the room measures better or worse with this in. I've got a feeling it's going to measure worse because windows do you a lot of favours letting stuff out, but we will see. All right, the SPL meter isn't saying much, but I literally can't hear a thing outside. That's worked remarkably well. All right, the really good news is I can't hear anything outside, so the window plug is doing its job. I'm really happy about that. Let's retest the room at the listening position we figured out earlier, which is 1/3 of the way down the room, 1.4 meters, and 1.2 meters listening height. So this reading on the screen now is with the window plug in place, and it's not looking too different to how it was yesterday, which was this, where we had the window exposed and after we'd found the listening height. So the issues were the null at 60, which is quite a wide band, and there's a little null at about 85. So compared to today, the null at 60 is not as wide, but the null at 80 is a little bit hotter. So we were going at 86, so that's about an 11 dB null at 86 or 87. This is set to 1/24th smoothing. Now this isn't really indicative of how we hear. People argue between it being 1/3 or 1/6th smoothing. Most people argue 1/3. Personally, I find that a bit strange. So when I use Trinov, I prefer 1/6th smoothing. So let's load that and see what that looks like. With 1/6th smoothing, which is a more realistic perception of how we hear, the null at 60 is about 6 dB and the null at 89, 90 is about 4 dB from 86 where we measured. So this is not bad at all to say there's no treatment in the room. It's a slight concern, the one at 1.1K, that's about 6 dB. That's just within a tolerance that I'm happy with though. Bear in mind, no treatment. All this stuff in the low mids, between 100 and 200, that's treatable with the Rockwool panels I have from GIK, although that is a 10, 12 dB boost. We can EQ that out. This is looking pretty good. THOMANN to the rescue for speaker stands. They were the only place that had the K&M ones which had the right adjustable height that I wanted in stock. I'm surprised that was still an issue. I ordered 2 pairs of drumsticks as well, and that's what they came in. Are you serious? What a waste of time packaging that is. Anyway, apparently I can still vaguely play. Whoa. Just about. All right, these speaker stands may have been an error. They're pretty sturdy. However, with a lot of speaker stands, you have the following problem. They resonate like a mother, and according to the design, it's a hollow tube with no bottom, so I can't fill it with sand. Sugar. That's something to think about, because it may not be a problem, because I'm going to put isolation pucks on the stands for the Amphions, but I know it's there. And my mentor, MSM, will be like, yeah bro, no. Hi Em. The stands are pretty good, to be fair, in typical K&M fashion. It is ridiculously strong, and that German engineering is exactly why I bought them. But I'm very surprised they've overlooked such a basic element. K&M, if you're watching, that's not acceptable for a studio monitor stand. I'm gonna have to figure out a way of plugging this great big hole in the bottom and then load it with sand or something of the equivalent. Or perhaps leftover Rockwool, but because it's an open bottom. Leftover Rockwool and gaffer tape. There we go. I've solved everyone's problem. To find the best speaker position, we're going to use my Amphion 115s just because they're knocking about, as you do. And I don't have my isolation pucks with me here. They're in the other studio, so that'll have to do for now. And then we'll get an idea of how the room sounds with the window plug, with the speakers roughly in this position. There is an optimal position, I think, was it 71 or 81 centimeters from the wall. So I'll do that, I'll push them back as far as I can, and then see how we go. Maybe do another measurement. Now that was just a guess, but it looks like the speaker stands are almost perfectly the right height. Actually, give or take the isoacoustics pucks, it'll raise them about an inch. They will be perfect. Nice. I'm going to sound check with one of my songs because I can get around the copyright. I apologise in advance, but the last video I had to re-upload because Content ID is so good on YouTube and you can't use any track without losing the monetization on your video. I mean, the ad revenue is pittance, but it does help make these videos worthwhile. So I'm going to use one of mine because I can get around it and just have an initial listen to how these Amphions sound. I wish you could see just how dark a place it can be. So that's going about 80, 81 decibels. I always forget how much low end these 115s actually pump out, even though they're technically roll off at 49 hertz. They do something that might be to do with the boundary against the wall. Obviously they have a rear reflex port for some rear firing bass. This is a similar concept to a rear port, but this works slightly better for several reasons. Don't get the harmonic distortion or as much, and you don't get any port chuffing. Really good speakers. Let's pull them away from the wall a bit. However, we need to be careful not to have the speakers equidistant from these two walls. That is a big no. But just a little bit. Where's my tape measure? About 70 and about 70, so let's go. There we go. Near enough, not going to be too precise at this point. This is just using my ear, not measuring. So don't let this go. Only try one more time. Yeah, they're sounding pretty good there. There's obviously that low mid build up that we saw from the measurements, but we're going to tackle that with room correction. I'm going to go outside and do another test, acoustic test, because obviously these are now pumping out a lot more low end than the sound bar, and you can hear it, you can feel the sound pressure level in the room, which is quite interesting how sealed it already is. So I'm going to just have another listen outside. So that's measuring about 7 or 8 dB louder than it was with the sound bar, and I can hear it's all in that kick frequency and a bit of the snare impact at 200. So all in the low end that we know from the measurements is building up, but we can treat with the GIK panels. Let's hear it outside. Yeah, it's about 7 or 8 dB again, and I can feel that wall vibrating. I was slightly hoping I wouldn't have to do the rock wall thing, but I think I'm gonna have to do it. It's not too much worse. I also can't hear anything outside, which means the window plug is far exceeding my expectations, which is great. Do need to put rock wool in that wall because that other side of that wall is vibrating. The gym matting so far has proven a good idea because it's the vibrations in the low end that are kind of trying to resonate. I had the stand at one point just resting on the floor on one leg and I could feel it. So that's a good idea, and the rugs will help. In terms of getting the right speaker positioning, I'm kind of going to see how we go for now. Well, I suppose we should do a measurement. Let's not be lazy. Okay, the speakers in this position aren't reading too badly. They're pretty flat above like 1K, which is good. There's a weird bump in the top end at like 12K. Don't know what that's about. Internal flutter, I'm guessing. But there is two problems. Obviously, there's the null at 60, which is 60B. That's not the end of the world. But there's a massive one now at 92 dB. That's basically a cancellation. Got another one at 163, which did line up with the AMROC measurements from video 1, if you remember that. So that's interesting how accurate that was. Now that's about a 10 or 11 dB null. Let's check it with 1/6 smoothing, which will be closer to how we actually hear. So 6 dB null at 165, 6 dB null at 60 and 93, 94 hertz. Yeah, that's an 18 dB null. That's bad. So we're going to have to do something about that, which basically means experimenting with the speaker positionings, which I won't bore you with, but I'll show you what I land with at the end of the video. To try and get around this modal problem, I've gone back into Room EQ Wizard's Room Simulator, and I've put in the measurements where I've settled on the listening position based on the pink noise played through the room earlier. So I've set myself at 1.20 meter high, speakers at the same and then I'm playing around with the front speakers, and as far as that null at 95 goes, I can largely get rid of it. You can see it there where I have the speakers at 70 centimeters. If I take them all the way back to the wall, and bring them in, so they're 80 centimeters away from either side of the wall and just tucked in slightly, which is going to mean they're a meter apart. So my listening position needs to be a meter, which is fine for the 115s, but it's not ideal for the 218s if I put them in. But let's try it with these and then figure it out. In theory, this should help with that null. Let's see if the theory lines up with the reality. So the speakers are now against the back wall. Actually, the frequency response is relatively flat. I know people might be looking, thinking, whoa, there's loads of jagged peaks, and that's like a 10 dB peak. Don't forget all that mid-range amplitude we can reduce. The issues are this null at 160 and 94. However, this is 1/24 smoothing. Like I've said, this isn't how we perceive audio. We don't perceive frequency changes in this much detail. 1/6 is more realistic, more indicative of how we hear. And if we go to 1/6, the null at 160 isn't a problem, and the null at 94 is still a problem. I mean, that's like what, 12, 13 decibels. That's not great. I just think that's the room. I think what the Amphion 218s might do is help mitigate with that with their MTM format. That helped a lot in my other room. That actually helped alleviate the null at 95 by like 6 decibels, I think. So it might be that those speakers help in this room as well. And also we've got room treatment to put up, and 95 is a frequency that the GIK panels and the bass trapping will catch. So it might be that it moves around less in the room and doesn't null as much. We'll find out. If it was below 80 Hertz, I wouldn't be confident we could fix that. But where it is, I think we can alleviate that further. So what have we learned in this video? Theory and reality sometimes overlap, sometimes they're different. It's great to do the research. The AMROC test was interesting and did identify some theoretical problems that have become a reality, but there's nothing better than actually moving stuff around and measuring in the room. Hope that video has been helpful. Stay tuned for part 3, where I will be building the acoustic paneling and installing the acoustic paneling. I think I might still put rock wool in the walls, but to be honest, I really can't be bothered making a mess of the walls. So I'm going to try with just the paneling in, maybe take another reading outside and see where we land. I'm even thinking of putting tech sound on that whole wall, just so I don't have to dig into it with the rock wool. But I'll make a decision before the next video. Thanks for watching. It's been emotional. Leave your questions and thoughts in the comments below, and I'll get back to as many as I can. See you soon.